It is 8:01, so I think we are going to get going here this morning. Really excited to be here on a Thursday morning with everybody. Certainly a little bit different. Jenny and I are also back tomorrow morning if you haven't registered. And yes, Doug, I hear you on the fact that the Flames are currently in first place. Emphasis on currently. But I'm very excited to have Pat Lipovsky and Ian Mcconnell from the Envision Group joining us this morning. SAIT has been working with the Envision Group over the past year or so. Envision does a lot of work in strategic consulting, and I'll let Pat and Ian briefly chat about that as we kick things off. But we're here today. It's going to be a little bit different than some of the Friday morning conversations that we've had. There's some really important information that Pat and Ian have to share with respect to ESG, environmental, social, and governance related concerns that frankly are really important across all levels of leadership in an organization now. This isn't something just for the C-suite to be concerned about. It's a truly important subject and one that we're excited to be partnering with the Envision Group on to bring a ESG related program to the market. So we'll chat a little bit more about that at the end. There's lots of great content between here and there. And I think with that, Pat, what I'll do is I'll turn it over to you as we progress, folks. I'll monitor the chat and the Q&A. Please do feel free to, there's always great conversation going in the chat here. So Pat, over to you to kick things off and we'll get underway.
Well, thanks very much, Craig, and good morning to everybody. Good afternoon, depending on where you are calling in. I know that we've been running a few calls this week where our morning is somebody's evening overseas, but my name is Pat Lipovsky. I'm the founder and CEO of the Envision Group. And just so everybody knows, the Envision Group, we've been around for about 23 years, and we've built a roster and a bench of different consultants who make up our organization. Largely former executives from multiple different industries, and we specialize in strategy consulting. Now, it's interesting, over the last number of years, we've had a great focus on the topic of ESG, which of course stands for environmental, social, and governance. And on the call to get together with Craig and myself today is Ian Mcconnell. And Ian, if you wanted to say a hello and good morning and an introduction.
Good morning, folks. I've known Pat for about almost 20 years now. He was my business coach when I was running a company in Calgary. And following that, I joined up with Patty in the Envision Group, and it's a wonderful feeling being able to help other people, other organizations with whatever challenges they have. I've worked internationally and nationally. Most of my time's been internationally. But other than that, let's get going here, Pat, and I'll put it back to you.
Yeah, thanks very much. So it's interesting, ESG, it's a topic that we've been studying for years. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the history of the session, or the topic, the history of ESG, I should say. So what we're really going to get into today is talking about what ESG is at a very high level. The second item is, why is ESG so important, and why is it becoming such a huge topic in business? And of course, from the financial community as well. And then, of course, we're going to touch lightly on how each person on this call can impact ESG on a personal and or a corporate level. Now, it's interesting because, Craig, you look at ESG, one of the questions that we have when we really get going is in terms of having organizations move forward and become leaders in all things ESG, we always pose this question, like, what does great ESG leadership look like? And Craig, if you don't mind me throwing that over to you, and I'll go to Ian after.
It's interesting. I'm not usually the one receiving the questions here in the morning, Pat. So I thank you. I thank you for that. For me, there's a number of ways I think any leader can take a look at this. The one I think that most leaders have a direct potential impact on looks at the social aspect, right? When you talk about diversity and equity, inclusion on your teams, there's a number of aspects that we've chatted about in some of our Friday morning conversations with Jenny that I think leaders can certainly play an active role in there. And, environmental, when you're looking at what the organization does in a whole in terms of energy usage, waste, carbon emissions, and so on, might be a little bit more challenging for, perhaps an individual manager to impact. But the social side of it for sure, and then governance, without a doubt, I think every leader in the organization has the very strong ability to ensure they are following and supporting great corporate governance within their own company. So before I throw it to Ian, I'll just throw this to the group as well. Feel free in the chat. I'll keep an eye here. What your thoughts are on this question as well. I would love to hear from the audience. But Ian, your thoughts.
Yeah, great comments, Craig. I agree with you completely, fully on that. And depending on where you are as a leader in a group, if you're C-suite or a manager someplace, or in charge of a couple of people, number one item, I think you can use ESG as an opportunity to get engagement from your people that are below you, and also in an upwards fashion. If you can, from a social standpoint, if you can get all of your people engaged, you're going to be a very successful organization. Allow people to bring ideas to the table is the biggest thing. Make it part of their day-to-day operation, that they love to come to work and feel that they're included in the decision making from a day-to-day standpoint, as opposed to like C-suite organizations. C-suites, I'll probably talk about this later, but ask yourself this question: if the C-suite has an idea or their vision as to what the company is doing, how far down into the management system does that go? How far down into the company does that go? Think about that and put a number in your head. We'll talk about that later to give you an idea as to whether or not your number is close to what actually is happening.
Cool. Yeah, and interesting, a really good comment from Alan here in the chat that leaders need to model behaviors and own the sustainability purpose. Absolutely right. This, to your point, Ian, this flows down within the organization, and if your leaders and individual contributors can model some of these behaviors as well, it certainly goes to serving that greater purpose of the company. So, Pat, sorry, I just wanted to highlight Alan's comment there.
Well, Craig, you make the comment about fully completely, and I just think of the tragically hip. And but it's interesting because we look at all the different organizations that our Envision team has been working with, and I'm just going to throw a quick slide up. It's a little bit of a logo soup, just to show you some of the groups that we've been talking with over the years and working with to really build out the content that we've actually put together, and that we're just about to summarize and go over. And it's interesting. It's just like Ian had made the case and the point. We're not just looking at ESG from the energy standpoint. We're looking at ESG from the airline standpoint, because I don't think we're all going to be flying on solar-powered aircraft over the next short term. It's ESG is something that's here to stay, to ensure that we're all keeping ourselves as responsible as we possibly can. And then thanks for the comment, Alan. I seem to like tragically hip as well. But Ian, it's interesting because here's some of the points that we've been coming up with ESG leadership. And there's some good points to be made here, aren't there?
Very much so. And wherever you are in an organization, talk to your manager, whoever you report to, and ask them what do we do as a company from an ESG standpoint, and say, I'd like to be involved. And that I'm sure you will be.
And it's interesting too, because, education on ESG, there's some really good sources out there for everybody on this call. There's, of course, the Wall Street Journal is probably the best and most formidable source of information that we're keeping up to date on for all things ESG. There's another industry, there's an email that comes out. You can sign up for something called ESG Today to keep yourself informed and involved. But, education on these three letters and the topics under each one are only coming faster and faster. And it's interesting, aligning with industry groups like our local PSAC here in Canada, like, CAP, like some of the different industry associations on, within your respective industry. I know we have multiple industries, Craig, involved on this call today, don't we? So, it's interesting looking at one of the things we're going to talk about in a short period of time. There's some items, it's called materiality items. And what's interesting is there's a number of different sources that we'll talk about in terms of organizations that are regulating and measuring the impact that each one of our organizations has on ESG. And for the most part, when you find out about these, you actually realize that measurement is happening on your organization without you even knowing it by some of these regulation bodies. So again, today is about the what, the why, and the how of ESG. Now, it's interesting too, because in a lot of ways, in a lot of facets, ESG has been around for so long. And Ian, it's not to look back too far into your career, but ESG really started back in the 60s as socially responsible investing, didn't it?
Yes, they did. I can remember those days. There's probably people that are not even born back in those days that are on this call. But what I found with ESG, as I learned more about ESG years ago, I realized it's just doing good business practices. It's really what we were calling it back in those days. But now we have ESG as the moniker going forward, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's just a standpoint of there's 3 different categories.
And it's not like, some industries out there in past days, responsibility wasn't really there with emissions, wasn't there with how they treated the environment. And it's interesting, Ian, you and I are talking with one of our Envision partners that years ago, there's a gentleman in the Bakken region of the US that was on his way home from work and took a shortcut and dumped a whole massive tank of brine water into a farmer's field. And the impact of that, without naming names or companies, because that's not fair, but the impact of that was substantial, wasn't it?
It was, and maybe it was just because he wasn't aware of what he was doing, or maybe he was, who knows. But anyways, there was, when it was discovered, there was a financial implications for that particular company.
Absolutely. Now it's interesting today more than half, 58% of all endowment funds incorporate, from colleges and university, they incorporate ESG factors into their investment making decisions. And if your company doesn't have a decent ESG rating, if you're not living up to some of the minimum standards that are commanded by some of these governing bodies, then your cost of capital as a corporation grows significantly. And this is actually out of the Callan Institute in September 2019, so a few years back. And it's interesting too, because looking at ESG today, in the last 3 years, ESG regulations for all of our corporations grew by over 145% in North America. Like that's significant, isn't it, Ian?
Right, yes, and growth is going to continue. Europe is quite a bit ahead of us, so if you're looking as to what we're going to look like, have a look at Europe, because they're about 5 to 10 years, probably about 10 years ahead of us on that. And some of they're starting to mandate in their laws certain requirements from an ESG standpoint. A good example would be Shell in Holland.
Yeah, we'll talk about Shell in just a second because there's ExxonMobil, there's Shell, and Chevron just faced some significant challenges. But the most regulated topics today are business ethics, climate change, and energy use. Consumer rights are a big thing. Product and service safety is something that's really emerging and coming up in healthcare and pharmaceuticals. But these are topics that are coming up. And it's interesting, Craig, because if you don't mind me pulling you into the conversation, like we're giving a summary at a really high level of some of the training that Envision's been doing for multiple organizations, associations, and partners. And it's interesting because we've all seen this change so rapidly, even over the last 3 months. Do you want to comment on that at all?
Yeah, and I think for me, maybe I'll take a slightly different look at the question is that, for publicly traded organizations, this for me is probably the biggest thing that you need to be thinking about is because this is really being driven by investments, right? Where are shareholders willing to invest? How are they evaluating the organizations that they are looking at? Certainly if you're a fan of Succession, you may not be investing in Waystar Royco right now, but that's a different story altogether. But, investment is up nearly 70% since 2014 in ESG, strong ESG organizations, and it's up about tenfold since 2004. And I think, especially as we come through the pandemic here, we are certainly seeing, we've seen this, some of the social issues that have emerged last summer, and what's going on right now with respect to supply chains and how organizations are adapting there. The change is just escalating. And, what that means for leaders throughout the organization is you have to be able to take these issues and figure out how to convert them, make them meaningful for you and your team, and keep yourself aligned with the broader purpose of the organization. It's that role as a leader that becomes much more difficult as you're still trying to manage the day-to-day, all the interpersonal relationships, and how do you then take this bigger, I think for me, Pat, this often feels like it's an important concept, but like a nebulous one that if you're a middle manager, if you want to use that phrase, how does that impact you as a middle manager? What's important for you, and how do you help achieve your ESG goals in a company? I think that those are some of the things that when I look at this subject, I really try to get my head wrapped around, because it feels like this great big thing that as a middle manager, maybe I can't necessarily impact directly.
Well, Craig, you make a point there, because, even my young kids that are 21 and 19, they come back to me and say, Dad, university is really difficult. And I say, well, no, it's not. It's just time consuming. And, the interesting thing is, going to say, it's, some people think it's difficult, but it's just a factor of putting the right time in. And the same thing with ESG. So sustainable leadership, like people ask us, what is it? Sustainable leaders look beyond what's right in front of their nose. Like they look at not just the short-term gains, they look beyond short-term to see the larger organizational context of what they've got in front of them. And looking, even in the trucking industry and logistics, what was it? Amazon just announced yesterday that they're beginning to roll out and launch the Tesla truck, the big truck, to pull their trailers around the world. And they're setting strategies to ensure the delivery of results that really help them with their zero emission targets. And again, tough thing when you think, how do you actually accomplish a zero emission? And that's something we're seeing so many different examples of companies putting plans in place. They foster long-term relationships, both inside and outside of their company. They're balancing the interests of multiple different parties that are involved in E, S, and G. So sustainable leadership, you look at the leaders of our community. Interestingly enough, I'm having dinner this evening with 13 other CEOs from around Calgary of large corporations. And I know that this is going to be a topic at this dinner tonight. It's going to be a very big and interesting item to focus on. And then Ian, it's interesting too, because coming back to you, corporate sustainability, it's kind of an interesting topic, but when did you start hearing this one talked about?
In North America, about 4 or 5 years ago. In Europe, about 15 years ago. How Europe does business is totally different as to how we do it in Canada. From the standpoint, they have strategic partnerships between clients, and there's a tendency not to do that as much, but to the detriment of the industry, in actual fact, I believe. But it's just the way business is being run. Sustainability, we want to be able to survive for not just tomorrow, but the day after, put it simply as that. And there is a lot of indirect or consequences as well, or some people call them unintended consequences. Those can have a huge detriment to the company as well. But from a corporate sustainability standpoint, it really comes down to being a good corporate citizen.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, Rob Crooks, you've got a comment in here, thank you for the comment on the first point. Leaders need to raise developments, in business and social environment, into day-to-day discussions. And this is something each one of you on the call, when you think about sustainability, when you think about, the environment, you think about the governance of all of the above, bring your ideas forward. Like, this is a time where most organizations, the ideas coming that are actually changing the world, and not to be too global and large, kind of wide thinking, but the best ideas come from the bottom up in every single organization that we've seen. And what's interesting is, you look at the whole idea Ian brought up just before, there's a couple of organizations that are out there, ExxonMobil and Shell. Now, Ian, a couple of things have happened to Exxon over the last little while, haven't they?
Yes. people, their board has changed, shall we say, where they've
So
had two people that are very ESG orientated that are now sitting on the board. And so how is that going to change the direction of ExxonMobil?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting, Ian, because the board changed because of the outcry and the pressure from shareholders. Isn't that interesting? Exxon had a battle, and the proxy that came against their board, they won, and they changed a number of seats on their board of directors to ensure more environmentally focused people were on their board of directors. Chevron had a little bit of a different situation, didn't they?
Yes. Uh, the fact that they've been quite aggressive from the standpoint of their emissions reduction, that's probably a strict result of ESG conversations that have happened in the past. And of course, different companies, whether they're public or not, the larger the public company, the more scrutiny they will obviously have to them. So it's very much an state-of-the-art number one thing the C-suite is thinking of these days, I'm sure, is ESG.
And so for those of you who are working with public companies with shareholders, just look at this, and it's interesting to follow. This is an interest that's growing. Now, it's interesting because Royal Dutch Shell in The Hague, they actually received a little bit of a different amount of pressure, but it wasn't by shareholders. It was from the courts, wasn't it, Ian? With the
Yeah,
law courts.
yeah. Courts decided you have to lower your GHG emissions by 45% by 2030, and Shell Shell board has decided they're going to move headquarters from out of The Hague to London, and that is direct result of these kinds of conversations.
So it's interesting. They're going through all kinds of pressure, and they need to change, and they've been ordered by the courts to change. And of course, not to forget, we had COP26 that just happened over in Spain. They recently wrapped up, and Ian, I know you've been following this pretty close, but a couple of interesting points that came out of that, and we hope that there's action too, right?
Yes, lots of 130 trillion. That number just keeps going up every day. A number of other, there is a few commitments that came out of it. The organizers were hoping for more consensus from the countries, but it's gaining momentum. It's definitely not decreasing. One of the last items that came out of it was when India signed on, such that they said they were not going to eliminate coal, but they were going to decrease their coal, simply because they need power, and right now their only access to power is predominantly from coal. So their government is, from an Indian perspective, is being responsible to their citizens from the standpoint of trying to balance the access to power and minimize the use of coal as much as they can. But they're between a rock and a hard spot right now, and I can understand why they have said we can't eliminate it, we're minimizing it as much as we can. So they're being realistic, and that actually is a fresh way of looking at it from my standpoint. A lot of countries think there's a magic bullet here, and there isn't. The transition is going to be very interesting going forward. How do we get to lower emissions?
Well, Ian, there's even the old Statoil out of Norway is now called Equinor. And you see these windmills in the image that's on the screen right now. What they've done is they put windmills way out in the ocean so that they can harness the power of, but again, just another sign of some really good, changes in technology and innovation that's coming. And I'm sorry, Craig, I jumped in on you there.
Yeah, no, so I was there's a question that's come in here from Jenny, and thank you, Jenny, for this, because I think what you're speaking to, guys, is really triggering for me, that, these are big announcements with big, huge organizations happening over in The Hague and places that, to those of us sitting here in Tuscany and Calgary, just seem very removed. right? So, to bring it back to what leaders can do on a daily basis, how do you build these conversations in to a daily routine with your team or a weekly routine? Like how do you take what's such a big topic and bring it back down now to, okay, here we are, I'm a leader of a group. What can we do here today, team, to talk about it?
Well, Craig, that brings up a good point because, that is the question that we should be bringing to the leaders that we work with, to the teams that, work with us as well. It's the question that needs to be put forward, because if we're not asking the question, we're going to get hit by the ESG freight train, because it's coming down the tracks and it's picking up speed. And it's interesting because, pardon me, I get a little fired up with that. It's, ESG, like you sit back and I'm sorry, the question begs, here's the definition that we've actually pulled out of what ESG is, if you pull up Wikipedia and all of that. But environmental, social, and governance, criteria used by socially conscious people, which includes investors, shareholders, to screen not just investments, but to screen the responsibility of every organization that's out there. And when you actually show the impact on your company, there's a term out there, and you can see the nice hue that kind of resembles St. Patrick's Day up on the screen right now. But greenwashing is a term that you're starting to hear out there, and what it stands for is the companies that are saying things and paying lip service to what they're doing environmentally, socially, and governance-wise, but they're saying it, but they're not doing it. And greenwashing is a big challenge around the world, isn't it, Ian?
Yes, very much so. In fact, there was an international company that got caught from a greenwashing standpoint, and their shareholder value took quite a big hit, about 15% in the one day. So now we're at the point some people have decided that they're going to, some organizations have said here's what we're doing, and people have looked into what they're doing and looked back at the different standards and found out that, hey, you're not doing what you're saying. And now they're being held accountable for that.
Absolutely. And, the voice of reason comes from within. And, leadership, like leaders are tour guides that lead people to a positive outcome, that's in corporate context, that's positive in, ways that just don't include profit either. But, you look at the pillars of sustainable investment, as we talked about, environmental factors, it's the company's behavior on the environment, issues such as resource depletions, climate change, waste, even idling vehicles are considered under greenhouse gas emissions, and reducing that has a significant impact on the world. Social factors relate to the company's treatment regarding people, indigenous people. We're looking at people of all sizes, shapes, whatever you want to say. But this is something looking at the social factor and how workers, local communities, and including items like health and safety. So it's interesting because you look at the social factors, and then governance refers to the policies and the rules that we put down on paper, because nothing is real until it's written. And when we have strategy, we avoid corruption. Like there's nothing like the stories that we see in for Hollywood movies where people show up in a country with a big bag of money and they get what they need done. Like that's corruption, and there's now rules, not just through the International Financial Reporting Standards, but there's now rules that are included under, the ratings that companies receive on ESG to restrict that. So it's almost like a bit of a kind of a corporate watchdog, isn't it, Craig? Like this whole ESG thing.
Yeah, to an extent. And I think the other piece that I would come back to as well, and I know Jenny and I have spoken about this on previous conversations, is how do you just be intentional with some of these conversations with your team, right? How do you make a point of simply putting it on the agenda to start with? I'd be curious, folks in the chat now, and thank you for some of your previous comments there. I just wanted to come back to those. Those are really good and appreciated. Thank you for that. But I'd be curious just to learn, is this a topic that comes up in your regular team interactions, your team meetings? Feel free to comment there. I'd love to see that in the chat as to whether this is something that's intentional at your organization. There's a couple of questions that have come in here, Pat, that I'm just looking at live. So we've got a question here. I'm just going to read it live here. So this may be spoken to, so please disregard if it is. Pat, you use the metaphor of school not being difficult as long as you put the time in, much like ESG for organizations. This got me thinking about our students who have barriers to access education, whether that be socioeconomic, neurodivergence, etc. Got me curious about what are the inherent barriers to ESG in our communities that can't be solved through putting the time in?
Yeah, Craig, that's an interesting question, because what
Yeah,
comes to mind for me is, the word team is actually an acronym that stands for Together Everyone Achieves More. Now, pardon me to be full of it, because sometimes I am. But the interesting thing is that when you look at the concept of team, this is something that it's our responsibility as citizens within Canada, within any country, to not just focus on ourselves, but it's to put something forward towards others so that they have access. And that's under the capital S of ESG for social. And Ian, it's interesting. We've seen many things in that regard, but yeah, like let's start looking around us and ensure that we look at the groups that don't have access. And here's a good one. Pardon me to go on with this, Ian, but look at this whole thing with vaccinations. There's parts of the world that can't afford them and can't bring them in, and they're turning to some of the first world countries to assist them. And that, to me, that's part of our responsibility with the capital S of ESG. What would you have to say about that, Ian?
Yeah, that was one of the conversations in well, COP26 about how developed countries to help it's part of their responsibility to help undeveloped countries develop develop their societies, develop their infrastructure, and that's still a challenge from COP26. A lot of countries did not provide funding for that, or Canada did. The majority of the poverty and pollution are directly related. If you look at Asia and Africa, those areas are the most polluted areas of the world, and they have the greatest poverty. A third of the people in the world don't have electricity. But they have candles, or they don't have any light. So if we can help countries, areas get out of poverty, that will in actual fact allow them to clean up their environments. So socially, from a global standpoint, it's S is the big one.
Well, Craig, I hope I addressed that question, because I think I went off in a few different directions. But it's interesting. A good question. Now, as we ponder that same question, I'm just going to throw this up for everybody's consumption. But here's just a few of the topics that would be included as materiality items under each one of the E, the S, and the G of ESG. Now, it's interesting because, when we do our training, Craig, just to comment on that just briefly, what we've actually put together is we've actually put together the full workflow and process that we see other organizations utilizing to ensure that they have an ESG journey underway. They form committees, or whatever they want to call the group that actually oversees ESG for their organization. And, we've got a full process that we mapped out that we give to people in the training, so that they don't have to bring in super expensive consultants. If they need a tour guide and assistant, we're there to do that too. But it's interesting. These are the topics that people typically look at most closely in today's business environment, and this is not just around North America. This is globally.
yeah. There's a lot there to dig into, without a doubt. And sorry to just kind of maybe diverge of 1 second. There's a couple more questions here, Pat. And actually, there's a few more popping in here now, so I wouldn't mind getting to them if we can.
Please do.
Really good one here. I think, what are the 3 things preventing C-suite leaders from advancing ESG?
Well, that's a good question. I think the biggest thing that's really restricting them from advancing on ESG is they get busy with other things and don't make this a priority at the highest of levels. I think, we have to help people think different so that they want to act different. And the C-suite, I think, today is largely beginning to pay far more attention to ESG, because of the fact that they've got so much pressure coming from the financial community on their organizations. The access to capital to acquire new equipment, to acquire another company. Again, your cost of capital is significant if you're not paying attention to ESG and doing something about it. The cost of capital continues to go up. And that's something we're seeing on the private equity side of business these days.
Yeah. And I think the other side of it for me too, and there's a couple comments here that tie to this. That I just want to try and pull this thread of a thought together on that. Stacy's talking about ESG included in individual goals for team members. It seems that social impact or social seems to be the pillar that has the most direct impact that folks can look at. And I think I understand where that's going. Jenny's got another great comment here about accountability that's in the chat. And how do you I think it's basically coming back to what you focus on and what gets measured is what becomes important, right? And the whole piece around, for me, as I think about this around ESG and how it can relate to helping your team, is that folks want to be proud of where they work. They want to know that their company is doing good and great things and doing them ethically. And I think that can really contribute to motivation, productivity, like the cycle, the virtuous cycle that can develop here if a company is getting this right is really, really strong. So hopefully I formed a cogent thought there. There is, I don't know if there's a couple other questions. I don't know if you just wanted to touch on anything I said there, Pat or Ian.
Go ahead, please. Yeah, let's throw them at me.
Okay. So Sherry's got one here. What if your company is a small service provider for companies who want your company to create these policies? For example, ISO 14001, et cetera. Are there supports, learnings, trainings available for small businesses to ensure compliance to the needs of our clients going forward? So I'm not, it's not my area of expertise, but Pat and Ian, I'm not sure if you have knowledge here.
Well, we'll talk about that. And I think at the very end of the session, we're going to talk about a training here in Canada that's starting on January 25th. But yeah, there's resources available. And for the small firms that are out there, small companies that are out there, ESG is going to become more and more important to you because of the fact that the RFPs and the tenders that you're responding to, ESG is now becoming a part of so many different tender applications. If you want to go and do some work for a company, and you're their vendor, they're going to require that you have a position on ESG. And if you don't, you could lose out on significant volumes of business if you're not prepared for that. Ian, any comments on that? Because I know you helped the company prepare their ESG report. And
when in talking to service companies, I used to be on the PSAC board, but from even back in those days, 4 years ago, we were starting to talk about that, about it was an advantage for a company to have an ESG program already in place, just even 4 years ago, from the standpoint as it was starting to be looked at by operators or clients in the oil and gas industry. And it's part of the requirement right now, is they're going to be asking you that question. There's no doubt about it. And that the stronger you have, you must have some sort of program in place. And from that standpoint, if you haven't, don't panic. We can help you with that. There'll be more topics about that. But this list here is what you need to be thinking about for now. But going forward, ESG is going to be same like as if you walking out the door to start your car. You need to be thinking about ESG every day.
Yeah.
And how can you work that?
Yeah. The job of a manager.
Yeah.
The job of a manager and leader just gets tougher and tougher, doesn't it? There's just so much you now need to think about every day.
Yeah.
Well, it's easy. It's just time consuming, right, guys?
Yeah, exactly.
But, so here's the deal: if you're as a manager, you can do delegation to get people involved. Simple as that. The more hands-on that you have involved and thinking about it, start the conversation really. And no matter who it is that's on the call, no matter where you are in position, or if you're employed somewhere, start the conversation. Yeah. And sometimes it starts at the top, sometimes it starts in the middle, sometimes it starts at the bottom. But either way, it's important to start that ESG conversation. And
well, it is.
I think you sorry, Pat, I think you keyed on something really important there, Ian, and we've chatted a lot about this in our Friday morning conversations, is sometimes there's not a grand strategy or a grand way to do this. It's just as simple as starting the conversation. So and I think that ties a little bit to the comment that Ron, you've got here in the Q&A around putting the time in is important, but it requires commitment throughout the organization. I appreciate your And I think we've all been through this, tired of being asked by senior management for net zero industry perspectives, plans on how to address ESG, and then hearing nothing back but crickets from senior management. So I think we've all been there on whether it's ESG or other topics. So just looking at time, guys, we got about 5 minutes left. So Pat, if there's, I think there was maybe a couple other points you wanted to perhaps highlight before we get into the wrap up piece. So.
Yeah, Craig, thanks. There's one thing, like benefits of strong ESG related practices. A couple of points on this, and then we're going to talk about from the finance side who's regulating things. But it's interesting because we've done ESG training, Ian, myself, and the rest of our Envision team for the Energy Workforce and Technology Council in the U.S., for the North Dakota Petroleum Council in the Bakken. We've done the same. The EWTC out of Houston also oversees companies in the Middle East and South America. And we just finished and wrapped up a whole ESG training within those regions as well. We just had to stay up really late at night because it was their daytime. But some of the benefits that we're hearing from the people we've already put through training is they're more prepared for regulation. They're adaptable. They've lowered risks. They're lower cost of capital that we touched on before, better operational performance, by the way, because if you're, following the system, it usually happens more efficiently, and generally better share price for the public companies that are out there, or valuation of your private business if you're ever looking to sell. So these are all big things that are important. But one thing just to touch on, there's regulators that are out there. These are the names of the organizations that measure our companies on how we are performing with ESG. So there's CDP, which is the Carbon Disclosure Project, and the other ones that you see on the screen, not to go through each one. But what's happening right now in the industry is similar to how the accountants used to have CMA, CPA, CGA, and they've all amalgamated into one. That's what's happening with ESG. And recently, there's an organization that was one of the leaders, the Sustainable Accounting Standards Board. Our Envision team is one of the first in North America to be certified to deliver training on their behalf, because they list materiality items in a foundation that really are the entry point, and we can share that through whatever details necessary. We just want to help companies move things forward in all good ways. And the training is part of it, to make sure that you've got a foundation and tools to bring to your team. But the recording organizations, this value reporting foundation is the outcome of all of these organizations and logos coming together under the Integrated Reporting Initiative. That's a global initiative today. So this is just a high level. What I'd suggest is go out there and Google ESG. There's a number of different sources that can actually put forward that are actually pretty decent for information. But the other that we can talk about is the Paris Accord. Everybody hears about that, but nobody really knows a lot about it. If you were to Google TCFD, or the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, you're going to come up with a website that looks like this. And man, is it ever cool. Because you can click on each one of these items. They're the result of the United Nations deliverables out of the Paris Accord. Schlumberger is a fantastic organization, just to kind of toot their horn for a second, because Schlumberger and their ESG reporting, they touch on 11 of these 17 initiatives, and they're doing something about them. So again, it's interesting. Knowing about ESG is one thing. Knowing how to measure and what's being measured is probably a great starting point. And of course, starting to really assemble interest and momentum with your organizations. The last thing I'll say, Craig, Google, go to YouTube, and in the search bar, just type in the words Leadership Essentials Dancing Guy. And you'll come up with a very alternative video that has an academic narrative that talks to each one of us and how we can get momentum going in our organizations on this topic of ESG, because our responsibility is to find our first few followers that have interest and influence to get this thing going within our organizations. And I think if you watch the video, you'll probably have clarity on what your next steps are going to be to grow ESG. But
what was the name of that video again, Pat? Leadership Essentials?
Leadership Essentials Dancing Guy.
Dancing Guy.
Yeah, Dancing Guy. This is alternative, guys. It's a shirtless dancing guy at the Gorge at an outdoor rock concert, but there's an academic narrative to what he does to create a movement. And it's the instructions in this video are the similar instructions that we can use to get ESG going within our respective organizations. And I know Jenny loves that video, and I think it's a fantastic one myself. But Craig, with that, I think we've summarized what ESG is, why it's so important from different angles. But the how becomes something we'd be more than happy to help out with, and we're starting our training on the 25th of January.
100%. And, I think, Pat, as we wrap up here, I think you've really touched on the one big idea that this is important. You have to start the conversation. And Ian, I think you really hit on that, right? As we wrap up here, so, ESG is so much bigger than what we can talk about in 45 minutes, without a doubt.
What I have found, guys, from the standpoint of ESG, it was an opportunity to get engagement from people that greater engagement from from all their employees that they had, and it starts with communication. So ESG is an opportunity for each company to become a better corporate citizen. In the long run, you're going to increase your profits. But I think Craig will talk about there is ways that we can help you from a financial standpoint for the training that starts January 25th as well.
Yeah, so what we will do is we will send out some information on a course that Envision Group is running, that SAIT is partnering with to help promote and get folks registered. We'll get that information out. It's going to start January 25th, running every Tuesday morning for 4 weeks. The course will qualify to be covered under the Canada-Alberta Job Grant, should you want to pursue that route for funding to support that. Fantastic program. We're really excited about partnering with Envision on this one. And again, more information will come out on this. I know we're slightly over our time now, so Pat and Ian, I really want to thank you for making the time this morning. I'm excited about the next steps that we have here. This is a hugely important topic. And thank you all for joining us, because it's, like I said, it was a little bit different this morning than what some of you may be used to if you joined us on a regular basis, but very important topic. And thank you for making your time. So Pat, Ian, have a great day. Everybody on the line, thank you. And we will talk to everybody really soon.
Thanks, Pat. That's great. Thank you.
All right. Goodbye, folks.
Bye-bye.